Hi, this is Nicole with Global Nomads Group. In this webcast, in partnership with the New York Times Learning Network, we will explore the causes and consequences of human trafficking, which has become the second largest black market industry, tied with arms dealing, coming in only behind narcotics. Coupled with this is the fear that this industry will continue to live hidden amongst the shadows of mainstream society. A common myth about human trafficking is that the industry lives only in poor, underdeveloped countries where individuals are forced into sex slavery to earn a living. In reality, human trafficking affects almost every country in the world, including our own. An estimated 2.5 million people are forced into labor as a result of human trafficking. 80% of those trapped are women and girls, and up to 50% of them are under the age of 18. Human trafficking sells children and adults for profit in industries such as sex and labor. Victims of trafficking are often sold by trusted friends or family members, or are misled into thinking they are being given legitimate jobs. Once they realize the jobs they will have to perform, it is too late to escape. What's worse is that internet sites such as Backpage.com are only exacerbating the industry. These internet sites continue to aid the growth of human trafficking, which has become the second largest black market industry, tied with arms dealing and coming in just behind narcotics. Human trafficking is believed to generate profits of an estimated $32 billion. Of that number, $15.5 billion is made in industrialized countries like our own. What are the underlying causes of human trafficking, and what is being done to combat the second largest criminal industry? We are so happy to bring everyone together today on International Women's Day to discuss such a pressing issue affecting women worldwide. We have an amazing and diverse panel of guest experts who are dedicated to preventing and combating human trafficking to speak with us today so we can learn more about what we can do to combat this industry. But before we begin, I'd like for all of you to take a poll. If you haven't already done so, please answer the poll question by clicking at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The question is, what is the #1 contributor to human trafficking's growth? Is it social and cultural conditions, poverty, corruption, or all of the above? Please take a moment to answer this question. And don't forget to send in your questions and comments. Go to the live chat function right below your screen, type in your name, where you're from, and your question. And now I'd like to introduce our guest panel. Diana Mao is co-founder of Nomi Network. Nomi Network works to bridge the public, private, and nonprofit sectors through enterprise and education to end human trafficking. They primarily focus on sex trafficking, seeking to increase the financial independence of women who are vulnerable to this industry. Lauren Hersh is the head of the Sex Trafficking Unit at the Kings County DA's office. The Sex Trafficking Unit works with police and other groups to hunt down and prosecute traffickers. They also provide support to the survivors and promote awareness about sex trafficking. And Norma Ramos is the executive director at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is a non-governmental organization that promotes women's rights and works internationally to combat sexual exploitation in all its forms, especially prostitution and trafficking in women and children. And now we'll have a look at an excerpt of a video from the New York Times.
From her left side, she's a pretty teenage girl. From her right, she bears the mark of 21st century slavery. Maybe words like slavery sound to you like hyperbole, but Long Pros was kidnapped in her Cambodian village at the age of 13 trafficked to Phnom Penh, and then endured years of forced prostitution and torture, culminating in her disfigurement.
The worst part is the fear. The fear was overwhelming.
Pras struggled to tell her story, but she found support from another trafficking survivor, Sina Van. Together, Sina and Pras offer a window into a world that few outsiders ever see, and that the brothel owners are desperate to disguise.
If you resisted, they electrocuted you. Sometimes, they electrocuted me twice a day if I argued too much.
They wet your shirt and they tie you up so you won't try and run away. And they put a wire, a live wire, inside of you.
In this video, Nicholas Kristof, a journalist of the New York Times, explains the horrific conditions of the sex trafficking industry. Whether the individual becomes a sex slave, domestic servant, or factory laborer, those trafficked are held in inhumane conditions against their will, which is why this is often referred to as modern-day slavery. According to the U.S. Department of State, at least 700,000 persons annually, primarily women and children, are trafficked within or across international borders, and approximately 50,000 women and children are trafficked into the U.S. We will now dive deeper into the topic of trafficking in women with our guest panel. Diana, while trafficking is a huge problem worldwide, even here in New York, your programs focus mainly in Cambodia and India. Could you tell us more about why you chose these countries and about the various programs you offer? What issues must you address in your programs?
Sure. Thank you, Nicole. As you know, trafficking is a global epidemic, and why Nomi Network decided to focus on Cambodia and India first primarily is in those regions, women are particularly vulnerable. As you know, poverty is a root cause of trafficking, and 1 out of every 3 person globally is living below $1 per day. And in Cambodia, primarily, not only are women trafficked, but also children. The UN quotes 14 to 18 years old, but I've seen in the shelters in Cambodia, some as young as 4, as young as 5. There's just a higher and higher demand for virgins, as you know, with the epidemic also of HIV. Being spread across the globe due to sex trafficking. So in my experience, Nomi Network, we feel that we can make a tangible difference in the lives of women by investing in them. And particularly in India, where Kevin Bales quotes that there are 27 million slaves today, and of those 27, half are in India. And that's due to a lot of other reasons as well, besides poverty. But we feel that we can really address the issue of how women are educated and underutilized in the mainstream economy, particularly when it comes to the workforce, particularly when it comes to even their education. Out of the 774 women that are, globally, individuals that are illiterate, 2/3 of them are women. And with the literacy comes a lack of job opportunity and a lack of ability to rise out of their poverty. And so in our experiences in Cambodia, Nomi is a young survivor that we named Nomi Network after. She, at the time we met her, was 7 years old, and she was in the shelter that we visited, and coming from a community that is extremely poor and desolate, and unfortunately, she was sexually exploited, and now she lives at the shelter permanently because of her mental trauma. So that's just one story of the hundreds of thousands of women that are in Cambodia and India that lack opportunity and are in a position of extreme vulnerability.
Thank you, Diana. Lauren, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was established in 2000 to combat trafficking in persons, to ensure just and effective punishment, and to protect their victims. Could you please elaborate more on the federal and state laws, the current laws, that focus on human trafficking?
Thanks so much, Nicole. So the TVPA basically states that sex trafficking happens when a commercial sex act is induced through force, fraud, or coercion. While state laws vary, the New York state law essentially states that a person is guilty of sex trafficking when he or she intentionally advances or profits from prostitution by a designated method. And these are typically methods that pimps use to maintain control over their victims, such as providing a drug to their victim, making a false statement to the victim, withholding identification, and this could be any identification. You know, when we first saw these cases, we thought that the identification was just going to be immigration documentation. And what we found here in New York is that that traffickers are actually grabbing any sort of identification, social security cards, school IDs, licenses, and other documentation, requiring a real or purported debt to maintain control over the victim, and also, and this is sort of the method that we see so frequently, using any sort of force, a real force or force, physical force or threat. And in many of our cases, what we actually see is many of these different methods are used, and so we're charging many of these subsections when we're charging sex trafficking.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Norma, when referring to commercial sex, there are three parties involved. There's the buyer, or the John as they are often referred to, the seller, or the pimp, and the victim. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women promotes the Nordic model, which decriminalizes the women in prostitution and criminalizes the buyer and seller. Could you please explain this more?
Well, actually, to meet the definition of trafficking, you don't need three people. You could also have trafficking involving two people where the buyer is acting as the trafficker. So that's important to understand. Now, one of the things that we know, we see as a key factor as to why human trafficking exists is gender inequality. The fact that you young people are continuing to grow up in a world where women and girls still don't have equality. This is a huge problem, and where there is so much violence against women, this is a huge factor in why you are growing up in a world where human trafficking is happening. Now, the rest of us have a lot to do to end human trafficking, and one of the things we can do is to educate ourselves about what prostitution actually is and how we can end what the end result of sex trafficking is, which is commercial sexual exploitation. And we support the world's first, most inspired legal model that recognizes prostitution as violence against women and as being at odds with achieving equality for girls and women. And that law came out of Sweden. It's over 10 years old, and it's been evaluated to be very effective. And what it does is it says, we in the world have been arresting the wrong people. We have been arresting the victims, the prostituted. We should be arresting those who would buy them for sex, which is mostly men who buy women and children for sex. So the Nordic model was first originated in Sweden. It was then passed in Norway and then in Iceland. So it is a very women's rights, today is the International Women's Day, based law, and we must pass that law all over the world so that everyone knows that it's not okay to buy sex.
Thank you, Norma. And remember, you can send in your questions and comments by using the live chat function at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your name, where you're from, and your question or comment, and we'll get to those in a second. So also remember to answer the poll question. Go to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, click the poll button, and answer what you think is the correct answer. All right, and now a look at a video produced by the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women.
Wanted. Women and girls, seeking individuals with an entrepreneurial spirit. all ages, must be willing or unwilling to travel. Flexible work hours, written and verbal communication skills, not required. Experience in economic hardship, social isolation, and inequality a plus. Applicants should have a comprehensive understanding of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance abuse. We offer awards, trips, and a unique combination of verbal abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, and captivity with no opportunity for career growth. No references needed. All shifts available. Inquire within.
What? Prostitution is not work.
This video, produced by the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, highlights the fact that deceit plays a large role in the human trafficking industry and the fact that prostitution is an acceptable form of work, which it is not, and both contribute to the high demand for sex trafficking. The roots of human trafficking lay in the socioeconomic disparity that is present worldwide. Although most victims are coerced into human trafficking by their traffickers, others are forced into it by adverse socioeconomic circumstances. The question we'll be tackling in this segment is, what is the main cause of human trafficking? Diana, how does the socioeconomic circumstances contribute to the vicious cycle of human trafficking? And what does Nomi Network do to combat this in their programs?
Thank you. I think it's about alternatives. In the United States, we have labor laws, we have even enforcement of those labor laws sometimes. However, in countries like Cambodia and India, you have the laws in practice. You have the laws developed, but in practice and in theory, there's a lot of other complications in actually moving forward and implementing those laws. And so, particularly in regions like Cambodia and Southeast Asia, you hear a lot about factories, exploiting their workers committing suicide and whatnot. And for us, it's always about creating opportunities for women that are sexually exploited. But in that process, these women get fair wages, health care, and other benefits that these women are typically also exploited in labor as well. And the poorest of the poor, those that make less than $1 a day, they really don't have alternatives. And so they could be either coerced, or some even willingly, or some sold by their parents, as in many cases of the underage shelters that we visit in Cambodia, that's pretty apparent and prevalent. So what we do to address it is by investing in the lives of the women, by creating economic opportunities for them, and leveraging the resources in that specific country. So in Cambodia, the garment manufacturing industry is robust. And so we focus on that in creating social enterprises and really enhancing their structure and their ability to sell the products in the mainstream market, which will generate more opportunities for these women. While simultaneously, 100% of our proceeds are invested back into their training, into helping them move up, particularly in fashion design and marketing. And in India, we're launching a program to train 120 women who 90% of them are illiterate, have never worked in their lives, and we're preparing them for the mainstream workforce where they can have better alternatives, where they can invest into the lives of their children. As it's apparent, and research shows that women who have economic options and stability tend to invest in their families, tend to send their kids to school, tend to provide for their households. So that's our approach.
Thank you, Diana. And you bring up a really great point, and the fact that human trafficking takes many forms, and one is being a factory labor. It's not always sex trafficking. So thank you so much. Norma, according to the New York Times, poverty, poor governance, and corruption are at the core of sex trafficking problem. How do these factors play a role in the industry, and what, in your opinion, is at the core of the problem?
Well, given that the vast majority of human trafficking victims are women and girls, I would say that gender inequality is at the heart of the problem. There are other factors that make it worse. Poverty certainly is an exacerbating problem, but poverty does not cause prostitution. Gender inequality causes prostitution. And a distorted view of human sexuality is at the heart of this as well. Now, what do I mean by that? Young people today are growing up in a culture where they are bombarded with images of sexual violence. And I want to talk for a moment about pornography. One of the things that's happening in our society and throughout the world is that because of the internet, children, young boys, are being exposed at younger and younger ages to pornography. And this is shaping their ideas around sexuality and about girls and women. And what we are finding is that when these young boys who've grown up on a steady diet of this kind of imaging that is a distortion of what a healthy sexuality would look like, and a healthy sexuality would look like respecting women and girls as equals and seeing sexuality as something that involves shared pleasure, not a boy or man doing something to a female subject. What I just said is a pornographic definition of sexuality. And the opposite, of course, would be healthy, which is a shared sexuality, shared pleasure, and no one is being put down. So we're talking about video games, for instance, like Grand Theft Auto. So the whole culture now is being informed by these pornographic views which introduce violence into sexuality. Grand Theft Auto, what is the object of that? To kill a prostituted woman. So there are huge cultural influences that are normalizing violence against women and girls that young people are being exposed to on a regular basis. And that is impacting not only the way boys view themselves as future men, but also the way girls see themselves, that their value then is to be sexually available and sexually appealing. So these are highly destructive cultural factors that young people especially are being exposed to.
Thank you so much, Norma. And I'd like to now ask the same question to Diana and Lauren. What do you think is at the core of the sex trafficking problem? Diana?
I think Norma raises a really good point. It's these, mindsets and really a lot of systematic. It's an ecosystem, I think, in terms of poverty and how they relate to, corruption and how that relates to lack of rule of law and how that relates to, in essence, the normalization of violence against women. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't look at it in silos, but I would look at it together. And all of these variables, I feel, have a very significant contribution to the exploitation of women. And, ideally, we would implement policies that really protect women, but then you have the human component, which Norma points out, in terms of, media, in terms of pornography, in terms of even daily, encounters with men and women, in the way that there's catcalls when people walk down the street, that disrespectful. And so you have to really, I think education is critical, and I'm so thankful that you convened all of us to share, because with education, hopefully comes a change in attitude, a change in mindset, and in taking action.
I want to point out that the average age that a girl is forced into prostitution is 12 to 14 years old. And when we're talking about that age, we're really talking about an acceptance in our society for gender inequality. And when we're talking about that statistic, we're really talking about girls here, boys 11 to 13 years old. And so I think that there must be some significant community outreach. We need to do a very exceptional job of educating our community, getting into schools, getting into community groups, getting into religious organizations, and educating about signs, identification of sex trafficking. And I think that only with that broad-based education campaign are we going to be able to effectively combat sex trafficking.
Thank you so much, everyone. And just a reminder, everyone, send in your questions and comments now. We're going to get into them in 2 seconds. So send them in so we can get them prepared. One last question. Lauren, in a New York Times article by Nicholas Kristof, you mentioned Backpage as being a great vehicle for pimps to sell their girls. Why is Backpage what is Backpage, first off, and why is it so popular in this industry? And why isn't this site shut down?
Well, Nicole, you ask a lot of very, very important questions. Backpage.com is a website that is owned by Village Voice Media. Backpage.com is much like what Craigslist was several years ago, and Craigslist still has problems with prostitution. Let's not fool ourselves. Backpage.com actually has advertisements in their adult sections and in other sections of the website that sell girls. Let's be very clear about what's happening here. We are watching our young girls being sold on Backpage.com. I've seen girls as young as 12, 13 years old sold on Backpage. Why is the website not shut down, and how does the website operate? Well, I think very simply money talks. And I think that Backpage.com, like other websites that are selling girls, are making a tremendous amount of money, but it is so imperative that we send a very clear message to Backpage.com and to other websites such as Backpage.com that there has to be some sort of social responsibility. We cannot be selling girls, women, and boys on websites or really anywhere else.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And remember, get those questions and comments in. And remember to take the poll question. So go to the right-hand corner of your screen and click the poll button and answer the question. What do you think is the #1 contributor to human trafficking's growth? Social and cultural conditions, poverty, corruption, or all of the above? So according to the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. is principally a transit and destination country for trafficking in persons. It is estimated that 15,000 to 18,000 persons, primarily women and children, are trafficked into the U.S. annually. Now, each panelist will have a few moments to answer this question. With all this knowledge, everything that we've just learned, what can we do as global citizens to help combat this human trafficking industry? First, Diana.
There are definitely a lot of ways to contribute. I'm sure the other panelists will cover that. But from Nomi Network's perspective is really to purchase products that are fair trade, that create job opportunities for women and those that are vulnerable. And in essence, we also develop products that are on our website that are made by survivors of sex trafficking and at-risk women. But also it's to really tell retailers use your purchasing power to vote, in essence, and really tell retailers that you like them to look more carefully at their supply chain to make sure that there aren't any people being exploited within each level of the supply chain. The furthest you get overseas in terms of manufacturing, the more removed the consumer is from that product. And so we really hope that we can close that gap within the next few years so that consumers can really directly see the impact that they have by using their money, using their dollar to purchase products that will empower women.
Well, as I said, I think that education is critical, but I also think people need to speak out. I think that once people are educated about what sex trafficking looks like, what human trafficking looks like, then we have a better chance that the community, who's really, those are our eyes and ears, those are the people that are going to be able to reach out to law enforcement, to organizations, and to be able to say, this is happening right here. This is happening right under my nose, next door to me, down the block from me. And I also want to point out that when we're talking about human trafficking, many people want to believe that this is a problem that affects only the foreign-born. But what we're seeing here in New York and throughout the country is that many of our victims are American-born victims. And I know that people sort of have a hard time stomaching that, but that is the truth. We're dealing with American-born children, we're dealing with foreign-born children, and we have a real obligation to keep our eyes and ears open and to become knowledgeable so we can point this out.
I'm so glad that Lauren made that point, that many trafficking victims, if not the majority, are actually U.S. citizens. They are disproportionately survivors of foster care. They are disproportionately children of the poor, and they are disproportionately children of color. What can we do? Well, there is so much that each and every one of us can do. On the labor trafficking side, I have been a big proponent that the way that we end labor trafficking is to support labor unions. Learn about your labor history. Understand what it took for organized labor to create these unions, and we have got to support that we don't lose our unions and that we grow them. We also should not be buying products that have been made under conditions that were slave-like conditions. We should find out where our products are made, and if they have been made under suspicious conditions, don't buy them. On the sex trafficking side, so much again. We have done an action against Backpage.com. We held a demonstration a few months ago at their headquarters here in New York City. We garnered the support of 120 leading other human rights organizations and prominent individuals like Alicia Keys and Gloria Steinem. So we need to build pressure on the Village Voice Media and tell them that it is an unacceptable act of corporate irresponsibility to be an online pimp, to be facilitating online pimping. This message has got to go to those who take ads out on that website. Now, we also need to really begin to think about how we talk about and think about prostitution. We should never call anyone a prostitute. Prostitution is actually a verb, not a noun. We are not that which is done to us. So don't call anyone a prostitute. Say prostituted woman, prostituted child, prostituted boy or man. So if we change the way we talk about the world's oldest oppression, we can begin to raise the consciousness that builds an understanding that those who are commercially sexually exploited are actually the victims, and they are not criminals, and we should be arresting those who would sell them and those who would buy them.
Thank you all so much. Those are all amazing ways for us to get involved and help combat this industry. And now we're going to take questions from our audience. The first one is for Lauren. They were wondering, can you explain a case that happened in New York City that has to do with human trafficking? Thank you.
Sure. So cases come to us many different ways. This particular case came in. It appeared to be a domestic violence case, which many of our cases actually come in as misdiagnosed domestic violence cases, boyfriends and girlfriends. And then when we start peeling back the layers of the case, we actually realize that while there is the complexity of perhaps a strong relationship, it is a trafficker and the victim. This case was the case of an 18-year-old young woman. She had been lured in under the guise of the trafficker's. He was going to be her boyfriend. That's what he told her. As many of our cases come in, he told her that he was going to love her, he was going to take care of her, and he was going to buy her lots of things. She believed him. She wanted so badly to be loved. She wanted so badly to be taken care of. And within just a few days, he convinced her that he was having some financial difficulties, but things were going to get better for them, and they were going to work together. And all she needed to do was go downtown, and she just needed to sell herself just a few times. Well, a few times turned into a few times a day. And a few times a day turned into 10 times a day. And then it turned into 7 days a week. And what she found herself doing was she had to post on Backpage.com. She had to walk on the track, an area that was a designated area for prostitution by many traffickers. And she had to make a quota, an amount of money. hers was approximately $750. And if she did not make the $750, she was beaten, she was hit with all sorts of objects, and she was told that she needed to stand outside naked in the middle of winter. And when she came in, she was lashed with belts, a broom, and anything that the trafficker could get his hands on. When we first met this victim, she started disclosing this information, and she started disclosing that she was not the only victim, that there were other victims, and we ended up prosecuting this defendant with 3 victims, and he ended up pleading guilty, and he's currently spending a lot of time in jail.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren, for telling us all that. And it kind of goes back to the fact that deceit plays a very large role in this industry. So this next question I will pose to Lauren first, and then maybe Norma and Diana can talk about this as well. But is human trafficking prevalent in more prevalent in New York City or in other U.S. cities or outside the world as well? So Lauren, why don't you take this first?
We have a huge problem here in New York City, but we have a huge problem in just about every city in this country, if not every city in this country, and rural areas. The problem is not isolated to cities, and we have a tremendous amount of work to do. What I think, when we first started looking at this issue several years ago in our office, we thought we were only going to see a handful of cases. We didn't really know just how broad this issue was. And once we started pulling back the layers, we realized that we hadn't even scratched the surface, that this issue is everywhere, that there are so many victims being sexually exploited in New York City. And I think that as we learn more, we're going to see more.
Well, Lauren is absolutely right. There's a huge problem in just about every major city in the United States. But wherever in the world you find the devaluation of girls and women and an exacerbating factor, which is poverty, you are going to have human trafficking. So if we root out the causes of gender inequality, if we really work as a society and make a political priority that we are going to create equality for women and girls, and we are going to do everything we can to create economic opportunities for everyone, then you have the real ingredients to ending human trafficking. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, those countries have been doing the most to create conditions that create equality for women and girls, and they are reporting the least amount of human trafficking in their countries.
And Diana, this next question will be posed to you. Is there a correlation between lack of education and human trafficking?
Yes, I would say there is a correlation on 2 levels. The level that I discussed before, the fact that there are 774 individuals that are illiterate globally, and 2/3 of them are women. And in terms of the jobs and moving up the career ladder, these women just don't have the opportunity that typically men have. And 70% of the world's poor are women. So these are just not coincidences in terms of that correlation and why they're impoverished and what makes them more vulnerable to traffickers. I've been to villages through my microfinance research in Cambodia, in desolate villages, where a family of 7 has a bowl of rice, or 7 bowls of rice per day to eat. And so with that, I've seen fathers that have offered up their daughters to my colleagues, and I've read about how poverty and lack of opportunity is a breeding ground for trafficking. And so in these communities are communities where there is low education, where traffickers can come in and say, I'm going to recruit your daughter to work as a housekeeper or in a garment factory in the capital, Phnom Penh, while this area is probably like hundreds of miles away from the city. And so a parent that isn't necessarily educated, that isn't even aware of trafficking, sure, you're giving my daughter a job and opportunity where there is no opportunity in my community. Of course, they're going to willingly, offer up their children in hopes for a better life for them. So that's just one scenario. But you see that it's two levels. There's education, lack of education for women, and also in these communities where traffickers are preying on women and young children, there's an overall lack of education and awareness about this issue.
Thank you, Diana. And the next question I'll pose to Norma. When you think of high school curriculum, you think of talking about slavery in the past. You don't think about talking about modern day slavery. Do you know any school systems that are incorporating human trafficking into their curriculum? And do you think it should be incorporated into a high school curriculum?
I'm on the board of the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation, and they are actually working on a curriculum. They're developing a curriculum that will be about the fight against human trafficking. But I want to tell you about work that we are doing at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and we've been doing it for years, actually, and it comes out of the Philippines. We have boys and girls camps. We take high school age children, girls and boys, and these camps that were designed, the curriculum was designed by Jean Enriquez, who leads CATW Asia Pacific. And these camps are designed to teach boys about how to grow up to be men that do not consume pornography and buy prostituted sex. So this is a great model. We are now doing those very same camps and trainings, they're not camps, but those trainings based on that model in Ecuador. And we've done them in Nicaragua and various countries throughout Latin America. So this should be a part of the curriculum to begin to challenge the sex trafficking industry that would love to turn young boys into consumers of what they have to offer. And we need to reject that in a very concrete way with curriculum.
Thank you, Norma. And this next question I'll pose to anyone who would like to answer it, actually. A student found this article where it stated 70% of women exploited in film industry, ad, and fashion industry. What does this mean? %70 of women exploited in film industry, ad, and fashion industry.
Well, that's part of the culture of what we've been talking about, which is viewing women and girls as objects. That's step one. You first reduce a human being to a thing, and it's a continuum. So when you reduce human beings to body parts, then you can buy them as objects. I think, I'm not sure if we're getting to the heart of that question. Lauren, did you want to add to that?
I think that this kind of goes to what we're talking about, that there is a level of acceptance in our culture that must be changed about perceptions of women. I think that if that number is accurate, which is terrifying, quite frankly, but makes sense, then what we're saying here is that we as a society are accepting the exploitation of women and girls, and that is extraordinarily troubling and must be combated.
Thank you, and I think you're all right. I mean, how many articles, how many magazines, how many movies do you see out there? What about the big posters in New York City and in Las Vegas that showcase these women and it's very exploitive. The whole fashion industry is exploitive, and the film industry is exploited. So what could be done to maybe combat this or get rid of this notion that this is okay? Lauren?
Well, I think we as women need to come together, and we as human beings need to come together and say that we will not tolerate this. I think that statistic really speaks to me, because if 70% of of women in film, fashion are being exploited, we're not hearing about it. And we as a society need to hear about it, and we as a society need to say that we will not accept this. I think that the media also has a huge responsibility to really get to the bottom of this and to expose the exploitation for what it is. And I think the media has to do it in a smart and sensitive way. And we're seeing in the media, in many instances, we're seeing improper usage of words. I recently saw an article about one of my cases where my victims were called hookers. We have to really hold the media accountable and not tolerate this.
But I also think there are ways to really engage the media, particularly with Nomi Network. We work with fashion designers that are influencers in their respective fields. And, you know, in terms of the products that we design, in terms of even the images in our lookbook, you know, it's always, there's a lot of a tendency to really sexify and really appeal to the mass consumer. And to be real, I mean, we live in a society where sex ultimately sells, and that's what marketers are doing. But for us, you know, we've raised the points of what we stand for, and we stand firm in that. And designers that we work with understand that. And so these are the people creating the products, creating the advertising campaigns, you know, really shaping culture in essence in what we see as mass consumers. So I think it's important to also focus on who those people are and really work with them and not in opposition, but come around the table and have open discussions about these issues.
Thank you, Diana. And another question from our audience. How much money is in the human trafficking business? How much would a typical victim sell for? So Diana, I was hoping maybe you can talk about this from a perspective of what you've seen in Cambodia and India, and Lauren and Norma can discuss a little bit about it as well. Thank you.
I think it depends on how organized the network is and ultimately who the customer is. But in India, I mean, I've heard as low as $5, in Cambodia, $50, $100. You know, that number really varies. But the bottom line is that humans are not for sale. And the bottom line is that we as a society need to stand up and say no, you know, and really start investing in the lives of people as opposed to selling their bodies. But really, I think we need to be purchasers of their products and services instead of their bodies.
So I think trafficking is a million, if not billion-dollar problem. And I also, like what Diana said, the prices range for victims. You know, as low as, I've had cases where the victim has been sold for as low as $35. I've had victims who've been sold as high as, you know, $1,000 or a couple of $1,000s for services and for a night. So regardless, the trafficker is making a lot of money, and all of that money is obviously illegal money.
And thank you so much, everyone. These questions are wonderful. And now a question for Norma. What are the girls taught in the camps that you were talking about? And what could you advise educators and teachers on who think that this topic may be too sensitive to discuss in a classroom?
You know, the girls are taught about their rights. They're taught about their value. They're taught counter messaging from what mainstream culture teaches them, which is that their value and worth is in their sexuality and their being sexually appealing. And they're taught how to be less vulnerable to sex trafficking. I forgot the second part of the question.
What advice would you have for educators or parents who think this is too sensitive of a topic?
You know, I actually struggle with that too. I normally speak to college-educated people. I usually speak to college-educated people and then policymakers. And when I speak to high school students, I'm very careful about what I say. And then on the other hand, I realize that teenagers are being exposed to pornography through the internet and other ways all the time. So I think that we're fooling ourselves as adults when we think that children are not being exposed to the socializing agent. That's what we call pornography, a powerful socializing agent. So I think if we're talking about the average age of entry into prostitution being 13 and 14, 12, 13, and 14, so children are being sexually exploited, children are being exposed to pornography, they're playing video games that have really dangerous messaging around sexuality and violence against women. We need to be very clear about that. And so if we're honest that they're being exposed to sexually explicit materials, then our messaging to counter that has to be mindful of that. And that's why I talked about pornography, because I know that youth are being exposed to it. And they need to understand that pornography is highly political, just as prostitution is. And they need to understand what they're looking at, what the messaging is, because we don't want organized crime to be teaching our youth about human sexuality. And that's who largely is producing pornography and distributing it.
Nicole, can I just jump in for one moment? I want to say that many of the girls that I see are 15 years old. That's probably the average age of a girl that I see. And so and when I speak with her, she tells me that she's been in the life, that's the language, for 2 to 3 years. And so I think it's really critical that we're speaking honestly to our 12, 13, and 14-year-old children, and we're also speaking to educators. I know from my own work that that many of the girls who are in the life are being told by pimps, being required by pimps to actually go to middle schools to recruit girls. And so we have to speak with our 7th and 8th graders, and we also have to speak to our educators so they can identify the issue when they see it on the playground, when they see it at their school.
Thank you. And another question I'll pose first to Lauren, and if anyone else would like to comment, feel free. A class in New Jersey heard that the Super Bowl is a hotbed for trafficking. And with the Super Bowl coming to New Jersey soon, they were wondering what should they do, what are their thoughts, and how can they avoid this?
This is a great question. The Super Bowl is and has been for probably since the beginning of time, a hotbed for trafficking. And I think that it's really critical that we rally our police departments, that they identify patronizers, that they identify pimps and traffickers, and that they're really on the lookout. I think we also need to educate, as I've said repeatedly, our community about not tolerating this, and being really mindful that in those communities where the Super Bowl is going to be held and the surrounding areas, that we go in, that we talk to hotels, that we talk to hospitals, that we talk to pretty much anybody who will listen, and really educate them that if they see something, they have to say something.
All right, and one last question, and I completely forgot it. 1 second and we'll get that question again. And these are amazing questions. Thank you all so much for sharing your questions and comments with us. Are there laws in place that make what Backpage.com is doing illegal in regards to their ads? So I would say Norma is probably the best one, if not Lauren, but feel free to comment.
Lauren, go first. No? Well, there actually should be laws that make what's going on illegal, but the Communications Decency Act simply does not cover what's going on with Craigslist. By the way, we were the ones that did the demonstration against Craigslist as well, where we had the support of 85 leading human rights organizations and prominent individuals. And those ads have creeped back onto Craigslist. But Backpage is currently the leading online facilitator of sex trafficking, and they're operating in 10 countries. A lot of people don't know that, in 10 countries. There has been a lot of talk about what to do regarding the laws, but while we wait for laws, we must act, and we'll be doing another demonstration in front of the Village Voice Media in June. We must build pressure on the Village Voice media holdings company, which owns Backpage.com. And we can do that. And Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, I have to give him credit, led that call, which was to call on those who would pay for advertising on that site to pull back their advertising. So I want to give credit to Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, who, by the way, is the most prominent and leading journalist who has called attention to human trafficking. And those of us who are working to end human trafficking are profoundly grateful to him.
Norma said it all.
Well, thank you all so much. We're going to go back to the poll question now that you all took. So the question was, what is the #1 contributor to human trafficking's growth? 14% of you said social and cultural conditions, 7% of you said poverty, and none of you said corruption, which is interesting. But then 70% of you said all of the above. All factors play a role in the human trafficking industry, which is the correct answer. So there are numerous factors that aid human trafficking's growth. Social and cultural conditions, like Norma spoke about, is most definitely one of those. Poverty is as well. Corruption is as well. And gender inequality, I could go on forever, the list of factors that contribute. But thank you all so much for joining. This has been a wonderful webcast. I want to especially thank our guest panelists and the New York Times Learning Network. We've all learned that there are no easy ways to combat human trafficking, but we all must try. If you want to visit any of the panelist websites to learn more, and as well as Global Nomads groups and the New York Times Learning Network's websites, their Facebook and Twitter pages, for updates and additional resources on ways that you can get involved. There is a lesson plan on the New York Times Learning Network's blog, so if you wanted to integrate it into your classroom, learn more, raising awareness is definitely a start. And please tell us what you thought about this webcast, and go to the link at the left of this page and take a very short 5-question survey. So again, thank you all so much for joining this panelist. Thank you, Diana Mao, Lauren Hersh, and Norma Ramos for joining. Thank you.